Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Enrico Stradiotto, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. I'm with the Canadian Concrete Pipe and Precast Association, and I'm also the president of Ontario Public Works Association. So glad that you can join us for our last session today, session 11. And this will also conclude our fourth day of National Public Works Week. If you've not already done so, I'd also invite you to register for our last session tomorrow, Friday at 12 noon. And we hope that you can join us there. We're going to have our keynote speaker, Laura McDowell of the York region, who's going to talk to us about collaboration and partnerships in public service. We're also going to have our big announcement of the OPWA Technology Showcase winners. So for those reasons alone, please be sure to join us. So with that, I just wanted to give you some guidance here for today's presentation. This is a webinar format, so your videos have been turned off and your microphones muted. We do and would accept your questions, so we hope that you can send those to us throughout the course of the presentation. Jennifer will spend some time with us to answer those questions. So I always say sometimes those are the best part of any speaking engagement. So with that, you'll just go down to the Q&A function on your Zoom platform, and you can enter your questions, and we'll address those again at the conclusion of today. So please don't miss the opportunity to do so. All right, so today's presentation is titled Improving Stormwater Management for a More Resilient Toronto. And it's being presented by Councillor Jennifer McKelvie. Now, I was really interested when we had approached City of Toronto to talk about some of their big city projects that they put forward Jennifer to present on this. Typically, if you were reading a title like that, you would probably expect some stormwater engineer or maybe some climate data analyst to be presenting some of the information, but not to take away from Jennifer, because she is certainly a very accomplished individual, and she's also the chair of the Infrastructure and Environment Committee. But it will be good to get a different perspective, certainly coming from the end of the city in terms of the programs that they're putting in place to deal with climate change and providing a more resilient city. So with that, I'd like to welcome Jennifer, and hello, Jennifer. And I'll just read through her bio to get started. Jennifer McKelvie is the Toronto City Councillor for Scarborough-Rouge Park. In her role as chair of Infrastructure and Environment Committee, she is taking on an active role in the City of Toronto's climate change, resilience, and ravine strategies. Before being elected in 2018, Jennifer worked as a professional geoscientist and managed research partnerships at the Nuclear Waste Management Organization and the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. Her graduate PhD and postgraduate research was supported by numerous provincial, national, and international awards, including NSERC Canada Graduate Scholarship, and of course, the L'Oreal UNESCO Women in Science Fellowship. So with that, I warmly welcome you, Jennifer, to our session, and I'll have you take it from here.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you, Enrico and Brian, for the invitation to be here. I will share my screen if you bear with me for 1 minute here. Great, there we go. We're all meeting in different places, but I would like to recognize that I am joining you today on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and that Toronto is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. As you did hear, I am Jennifer McKelvie. I am the City Councillor for Scarborough-Rouge Park. It is the easternmost riding in the City of Toronto, and we're bounded to the south by Lake Ontario. There's a picture of it here. We are bounded to the east by Rouge Park, and then we're also very fortunate that we have both the Toronto Zoo and the University of Toronto Scarborough campus. So we're very much a conservation-based community environmental issues certainly at the forefront, as our major employers as well. But I'm not here to boast about my home community, which I think is great. I'm here to share with you some of the work that the City of Toronto is doing and that I've had the privilege to champion in my role as chair of the Infrastructure and Environment Committee, and specifically getting into some of our stormwater management program initiatives. So I was excited to speak with you today because I don't get to speak with many technical experts anymore. As you did hear, I was a geoscientist before entering into politics in 2018. The one thing I do miss is fieldwork and being outside. So my previous role was very much in contaminant hydrogeology, isotope geochemistry, having worked as deep as Copper Cliff in Sudbury, as far north as Greenland, and then as well as cold as southwestern Ontario and sampling some of the gas wells there. And I will say that you think you have to go north to get cold, you don't. It's pretty cold in southwestern Ontario sometimes, and the wind is pretty harsh. It is National Public Works Week, so I wanted to thank all of you for the great work that you're doing to build our communities to keep us safe. And I will recognize at the onset of my talk that the work I'm presenting is very much that of our great public works staff in the City of Toronto. So I want to give them a big shout out, and specifically our City Manager, Chris Murray, our Deputy City Manager of Infrastructure, Tracy Cook, our General Manager for Toronto Water, Lou DiGeronimo, our Chief Engineer, Michael D'Andrea, our Director of Urban Forestry, Kim Stratham, and the CEO of Toronto Region Conservation Authority, John McKenzie, as well as his expert staff, Lisa Turnbull, who works on all things ravines and meadowway, which I'll show later on in my talk. So one of the happiest moments, I will say, since I switched over into politics in 2018 was announcing the release of the City of Toronto's Resilience Strategy. And the strategy was developed through a process set out by 100 resilient cities, and it was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. So cities across the world are doing a study to say what are the perturbations that they are most susceptible to in the future. And obviously in some places that would be earthquakes. In Toronto, what was identified specifically was population growth and climate change, as well as rising inequalities. And it's interesting that this was released in 2019 and a pandemic was not in there. And certainly I think there's some big lessons learned throughout the pandemic in that the same groups that we're seeing are most vulnerable right now through the pandemic are going to be some of the same groups that are going to experience climate change in the most deleterious of ways. So there's a lot of learning, I think, that will be incorporated into the actions of the resilience strategy as it continues to unfold. So the strategy is really kind of overarching across the City of Toronto. It's so to speak, the strategy of all strategies. And it identifies actions for Toronto to survive, adapt, and thrive in the face of any challenge. And in particular, there's a large emphasis on climate change, which is what I'll speak to you about today. Because we know even as we do our part to decrease greenhouse gases, and we're doing a lot of work around that in Toronto. I could do a whole other talk just on that. It's my other favorite subject there. We know that despite these efforts, the impacts of climate change are being felt right here, right now. And a really great example of that, a very visual example of that was in 2017, when we faced record high water levels in Lake Ontario. Down in Rouge Park, the parking lot was completely flooded. There was water up well over your knees. And so this was, that kind of unexpected, that 100-year event that you have. And then 2 years later, again in 2019, we had the same record high levels of Lake Ontario. Our infrastructure in the city simply wasn't designed with those lake levels in mind. It was designed at a time where the lake levels were much lower. And there's a lot of rethinking and a lot of work that needs to be done so that we can manage these extreme weather events that we're seeing in these large amounts of water. The resilience strategy, though, it's not just about infrastructure. It also interweaves social and demographic equity as an important tool. We do know, I mentioned that the impacts of climate change will not be felt the same by everyone. Some people will have basement flooding, for example. Others that live in apartment buildings, they're going to be subjected to high heat, especially in the buildings that don't have air conditioning, those older buildings. So I was very happy when Councillor Pasternak and myself brought a motion to City Hall to institutionalize resilience into the decision-making process at City Hall. So as we make new decisions through the budget process, and when we think about infrastructure, we should be asking ourselves, have we looked at this lens of resilience? Are we prepared for this wilder weather of the future? Have we looked at how population growth may change what we're designing? And the other thing we're doing is we're starting to look at our budget a little more holistically as well. And we have all these different buckets in departments, but they're all contributing to resilience into climate change mitigation in some way. So we're starting to look at what that annual total is. And within the City of Toronto, I can tell you that this year we're spending $611 million on 439 projects that will make us more resistant to the impacts of climate, and that including both climate mitigation as well as climate adaptation. And the total amount that we're spending is over $4 billion over the next 10 years, but that's not even including the work that we're doing with, for example, upgrading Toronto Transit and some of the Toronto water projects that I'm showing you. So up until now, we were preparing for the impacts of climate change, flooding, heat, emergencies. We now know we also have to think about how we can be more resilient to many things, including a pandemic. Something we're starting to think about as well is cybersecurity, all those other different threats that could play in it. The strategy is organized under 3 goals: people in neighborhoods, infrastructure, and leading a resilient city. And for this audience, the focus is on the infrastructure goals, and those include that Toronto is more resilient to climate change, including the hazards of flooding and heat, that our infrastructure and buildings are resilient to a changing climate and reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and thirdly, that Toronto has multiple, reliable, affordable, and safe mobility options that reduce the amount of time it takes to get around. Those are our big 3 infrastructure goals for a more resilient future. And in today's talk, we'll be talking specifically about the climate change and the flood hazards. So here's the problem. You're all familiar with it. Wilder, wetter, weather. We know we're going to have more of this in the future. The problems that we see are, we result in Toronto, we have combined sewer overflows. I'll talk a little bit more of that. Our old infrastructure just simply was not designed for these large volumes of water. We have flooded basements that are happening. There's a great picture from CTV that I've included here. We've had flooding on our roadways with some of these extreme rainfall events. And all of this puts pressure onto Lake Ontario, where we have poor water quality. And certainly in 2017 and 2019, we also saw that we had water quantity issues as well. And that was certainly something new to us. So in 2003, the city released the Wet Weather Flow Master Plan. And it's a combination of solutions. So natural, those are the ones I'm more familiar with. Engineered, I know those are the ones you're more familiar with, but also measures that range from both big and small. So a whole range of scales. So some of the things that the goals are to eliminate discharges of combined sewer overflows, provide basement flooding protection, improve water quality, water courses, Lake Ontario's waterfront as well, protect city infrastructures from stream erosion impacts, and restore degraded local streams, in addition to protect aquatic habitat. So the Toronto Water Capital Plan for the next 10 years allocates $4.3 billion to the Wet Weather Flow Master Plan. So we're investing a very large amount of money into this, and that's because we recognize that our water quality is very important, and we recognize that these impacts are very hard on residents and will get worse if we don't make the investment now. So in terms of the measures, and I mentioned they're on a wide variety of scales. So here at some of the local, more localized levels, some of the things we're seeing are mandatory downspout disconnection. So downspout disconnection is mandatory citywide unless you can get an exemption on the basis that it would create a hazardous condition or is not technically feasible. And that approval would be through the general manager. The bylaw is applicable to all buildings, including residential, industrial, institutional, and commercial. I can tell you all of the houses in my community, we've all done that. I've done it as well. I still need to move one of my eaves troughs though, because every winter the mailman puts a note saying, can you please remove the ice that comes out of your eaves trough? So that was the one downside of it, is that we still have some work to do on that, but everybody has disconnected. The second is the wet weather flow management guidelines. So there are guidelines that set out objectives and requirements for stormwater management for new and redevelopments, including looking at the water balance, water quality, water quantity, among other things. And this is incorporated into the Toronto Green Standard. And we can't set building codes, but we do have standards, and we do try to really encourage full adoption of those. We have the Green Street Technical Guidelines. So Toronto's Green Street Guidelines provide guidance, standards, and selection tools for the planning, the design, the integration, and the maintenance of our green infrastructure options appropriate for the city streets. And there is an example here on the bottom of a rain garden, and these are sorts of installations that we're putting throughout the city so that we can start to retain waters rather than having them run off into the sewer system. We know we need to do more. So this year, or actually I guess last year now, although I think everything in a pandemic is a blur, we released Women for Climate, a new program. It's a C40 initiative, an international initiative, where we had 12 women participate in building up their idea through mentorship. And I will say that many of those were focused on rain retention, rain gardens, reimagining space. So I think the groundswell is definitely starting to happen. The public is starting to get interested in this as well. So there's also some very great rain garden projects being championed across the city by residents. And on my part, I will say that I'm very interested in permeable pavements. That's something that I will be speaking with Toronto Water more through the rest of my term. I know we have to look at how we can have incentives for residents to put in permeable pavement driveways as they upgrade and go forward, and how we have resources to provide information about that. So the basement flooding program, on the map here, you can see the areas in gray are the ones where they have basement flooding. I will say, sorry, apologies. I will say I'm very fortunate that through my community, through Scarborough, we aren't one where we have the basement flooding, and we aren't part of that program. But the City of Toronto has allocated $2.2 billion through the capital plan to basement flooding, and it's a subsidy, and it offers a financial subsidy of $3,400 per property to install flood protection devices. So this is through most of older Toronto, whereas I'm in a newer area. There's also regular public outreach and information that's shared. And the basement flooding protection studies, they recommend upgrades to the city's sewer system, overland drainage routes, and improving flood protection. There are 67 flood protection areas shown on the map. 42 have been completed to date, and 25 studies are underway. And so these, again, are a wide range of programs. So there's at the localized level, encouraging homeowners to make the changes. There's also storm sewer upgrades that are happening, underground stormwater tanks, and stormwater management plans being rolled out across the city in these areas. But the big problem we have through the older areas in Toronto is the combined sewer overflows. And I remember when I was a kid, and after a rainstorm, you could never swim in Lake Ontario. And I thought it was because of all the geese and the geese poop that got in, and so you couldn't swim. Now I know, as I age and become wiser and learn about our stormwater management, it's actually because of the combined sewer overflows that happen. So some of our cities' areas have combined sewers in which there is only one pipe that carries both sewage and stormwater. So unfortunately, when we have very large rain events or melt events, there is just simply too much water that's into the sewage system, and there is a release valve, so to speak, where they're discharged over into our streams. Unfortunately, that it's not treated. And these combined sewer overflows were designed to act as a relief valve, as you all know, but they do lead to flooding of properties, public spaces, and the overwhelming of our sewage treatment plants. And certainly, again, this just speaks to designing our infrastructure at a time where we weren't thinking about the population growth to the same extent that we saw, nor really the increased wilder, wetter weather that we're seeing. So this, again, speaks to why now, as we're designing infrastructure, we're trying to think with resilience about all of these different future things that we could be subject to. So the big impacts, I think we all know, the one that I always remember most is the no swimming in Lake Ontario. But of course, there's the discharges of nutrients, harmful bacteria, pathogens, heavy metals, oils, pesticides, contaminants, refuse, and other plastic waste that you see in there. So overall, this is degrading our surface water quality, in particular in the Don River and in Toronto's central waterfront. And it does cause nutrient enrichment that causes algae in the shorelines. And here's a map of the areas where we have them. So we have combined sewer overflows at 90 outflows across the city. And we have 11,000 kilometers of sewers, of approximately with 1,500 are combined. And about 110 storm sewers receive combined sewer overflows during rainfall events. So again, the big problem is that there's a large concentration in the Don in the central waterfront area. So the city dug deeper into the Don and central waterfront. It's a 267 square kilometer area. 1.2 million people in Toronto live in there, and our total population is about 2.9. So it is heavily dense, and 30% of the sewer systems are combined through this area. The big problem that we're trying to solve, well, in 1987, the International Joint Commission identified that the City of Toronto's waterfront is one of the 43 polluted areas of concern in the Great Lakes Basin. So it's a big stain on our beautiful city that this is the case. Poor water quality in the Don, the Inner Harbor, Toronto, Massey Creek are a result of this combined sewer overflows. And so in 2008, as per the requirements of the Province of Ontario's Environmental Assessment Act, there was a Class EA, this is the study area, and they initiated the project. So there's 5 projects that are interrelated that were with the overall goal to improve water quality. So the wet weather flow master plan, which I spoke about before, there's 2 projects that fall under that. So the first is the overflow tunnels, which will be under construction, are under construction and will be completed around 2038. And those are the ones I've highlighted here in red, because that's what I'll delve a little bit deeper into in this talk, whereas I won't on the others. There is also going to be a future high rate treatment plant facility that will be in production probably, needs to be updated later than 2030. Upgrades are happening at the Ashbridges Bay water plant. This is a new integrated pumping system, a new outfall, and new UV disinfection. So this is the largest combined sewer overflow project of its kind in Canada. It's a significant component of the wet weather flow master plan. And the overflow tunnels, it's an integrated system of tunnels, storage shafts, and coupled with the high rate treatment plant. And so it's really dealing with that overflow that happens and managing that. It's phased implementation at a cost of $3 billion, and it's expected to be completed in 2038. I will note that Toronto Water does an exceptional job with the way that they finance their projects. This project is entirely funded through the city's water rate. So the water user is paying for it and funding from the development charges. We have not received any federal or provincial funding on this project to date. So this is a map that was provided by Toronto staff, and as well as some notes, as I will say, they are the technical experts on this. What they are constructing underground is just absolutely phenomenal. It is a 22-kilometer system of 3 integrated tunnels, 12 storage shafts, and 27 connection points to the sewers and to 7 storage tanks. So essentially, this is a deep underground vault that is empty and then can fill with water when we have those overflows. It can be held and then it can be brought through into that new sewage treatment plant before being discharged. So the 3 series of tunnels are being constructed in 3 stages. The first is the Coxwell Bypass tunnel, which I'll show some photos of, and that's underway right now, followed by the Taylor Massey Creek and the Inner Harbor West tunnel. They will capture, store, and treat a mix of rain, snowmelt, and wastewater to keep our Toronto waterways clean. These projects will virtually eliminate combined sewer overflows and stormwater runoff into the lower Don River, Taylor Massey Creek, and Toronto's Inner Harbor. So we're looking to significantly improve water quality in these areas, enhance recreational uses, no more closures of swimming on those big rainy days, improve aquatic habitat for fish, reduce the nutrient levels and loads into Lake Ontario, support the revitalization that's happening all along the waterfront, and help the city meet those provincial requirements for controlling combined sewer overflows. Really, this is about improving capacity in the system so that we can service the population growth. And that's the growth to come, but also the growth that we've already had since the system was put in place. So here's a deeper dive into the Coxwell Bypass tunnel. The construction on this started last year. It is a 10.6 kilometer long, 6-meter diameter tunnel at a cost of $411 million. It is designed to keep stormwater runoff and combined sewer overflows out of the Lower Don, Taylor-Massey Creek, and Toronto's Inner Harbor. So it will capture that water in the tunnel system. It will transport it for treatment. And there's also going to be incorporated with that some offline storage tanks should they be needed. The overall benefit is that this is going to carry sewage for 750,000 Toronto residents. So here's some photos of the construction that's taking place. There is an enormous shaft that I had the opportunity to visit last year, that construction, and go underground. You can see the tunnel was first excavated probably by drill and blast to get the equipment underneath. So the excavated tunnel is down on the bottom here underground. You know, from my old days as a geoscientist, it was nice to be underground looking at some Ordovician limestones, very low permeability rock, be able to see, for example, there's not a lot of water seepage that's happening here. These are really, really tight geological formations. It's a perfect substrate to develop this sort of tunneling system into it. I wished I could find the amount of cement that would be used for this project, because I wanted to tell Enrico that, because I know he's the cement guy. But I will try to find that number and share that with you afterwards. And of course, I mentioned that one of the highlights of starting at City Hall was releasing the strategy. That would be the first. I will say that the second highlight was definitely meeting Donnie, the boring machine that will be used to construct this tunnel. So now that the original, the first shaft has been built, as well as that original excavation to get Donnie in and started, Donnie is underway, chugging along. So that's just a high level, some of the engineering projects that are happening in the city of Toronto to control stormwater. Not my forte. The next series are definitely more aligned with my previous world in geoscience. So I'm very happy that when I was first elected in 2018, Mayor Tory asked me to be the Ravine champion and to work on this project specifically to get the funding that we need to complete the work there. Here's a photo of our ravines. If you've been to Toronto, you know that we have these glacial sediments, very easily erodible, that are on top of that limestone. They create these beautiful escarpments and expose these wonderful sediments that people come from all around the world, frankly, to study. So they're beautiful, they're geologically important. They've been carved down over generations, and they also are very important natural infrastructure for the city of Toronto, which we have frankly taken for granted for generations. They provide sinks for carbon, they purify our water, they provide a home to many species, and importantly, they make us more resilient to extreme weather events such as that can cause flooding. If you put a dollar value onto our ravine systems to look at these ecological functions and how much money we would have to spend to replace them. So for example, if we had to capture that water and treat it, we had to capture that carbon, we had to do all those good things that are happening in our ravine systems, the dollar value is $822 million annually. So certainly I think any funds that we spend in there have a huge return on investment. And that's part of the story that I've certainly been trying to tell to our provincial, to our federal government, so that we can help close the gap in the work that we need to be done in these areas. So here's a map of the Toronto area, and the ravine system is shown in green. So our ravines cover 17% of our land, and it is a combination of public and private areas. So some is backyards, but the large majority of that is public areas. They are basically oriented into 7 north-south corridors, and that's simply because they are these drainage areas that drain down into Lake Ontario. What we're looking to do is several things through the Ravine Strategy. The first is the circles that are on there are areas of erosion and high priority areas for investment where we need to do invasive species control, erosion control, and other type of work. But the other 2 things we want to do through the Ravine Strategy is create a 81-kilometer new trail network through Toronto. And that is largely going to be accomplished by connecting the ravines in the east to the west direction. Most of the ravines, as you see, go for the most part north-south. They often have trails running alongside those streams, but we're hoping to create those connections. So on the west side of Toronto in blue here, this is what we're calling the Loop Trail. It's a 65-kilometer trail that you would be able to go completely around. And then attached into this here, down in the Don, this is the Meadowway, which will be a 16-kilometer trail that will connect through the Don River through to Rouge Park, again, out in my home community. The Meadowway will run along a hydro corridor, so it's also our opportunity to reimagine this space. And we do foresee for quite a while that we will continue to have these electrical wires there, but one day they may come down. So this is also a way for us to keep this land permanently in the public realm and in a usable way. The last thing I want to point out on this map is that the areas in the boxes, these are our neighborhood improvement areas that have been identified in Toronto. So these are areas with low incomes. These are areas with low employment, and areas where we certainly have more people in apartment buildings that need the opportunity to get outside. And so we are also strategically trying to create more parkland in those areas where we have lots of people in apartment buildings, because again, it links with resilience. We know they're going to have hotter temperatures inside those apartments going forward. We need them to be able to get outside as well. So what the Ravine Strategy did is it recognized this area has been really invested for a long time, but it also recognized that we have so many different people that are participating and working in that space. So Toronto Water has sewers that run into them and discharge. Transportation manages the bike trails that run through there, for example. Toronto and Region Conservation Authority is responsible for flood protection work, erosion control work. City planning is involved in what we do in these spaces. Parks, forestry, and recreation, well, the forestry side does the maintenance of that. They also do the invasive species work, and then any recreational opportunities that are run in there are done by them. And then economic development and culture also is looking at how they can use that as a tourism opportunity, for example. So we have all these different groups that were working in different ways. The plans weren't always overlapping. So for example, Toronto Region and Conservation Authority may go in and repair some trail erosion. Well, that might have also been a good opportunity to do the invasive species at the same time. It might have also been a good opportunity maybe for Toronto Water to do some upgrades. So this is really about trying to ensure when we go into an area of the ravine, we are all working together on that. So what we did is we looked across the city too this year through this budget process to say, what is the total amount of the amount of money we were spending in ravines? And it was $82 million. So $70 million in capital works, trail upgrades, etc. 12 million in operating funds, that's litter cleanup, invasive species cleanup. We've put additional money into that this year, and including also hiring students to do some of that work, recognizing that students are not having their normal job opportunities. Some good news, through the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan, we have 6.2 million in funding that's coming to this, but we know that we still have this big gap, and we've quantified it. It is 65 million over 5 years. So what I've been doing for the last 2 years is advocating to our federal government to create a natural infrastructure fund, because the funding doesn't fall under disaster mitigation and adaptation entirely. It also doesn't fall under active transportation entirely. And there's this gray area lacking funding. And the good news is that in the federal budget last month, they have announced that they are creating a new natural infrastructure fund. It will be 200 million over 3 years across Canada. And importantly, they cited the Ravine Strategy as an example of the type of project that it could fund. So fingers crossed, I am hopeful that we will be able to close that gap and get this work done. So again, from a bird's eye view, these are beautiful spaces, but when you go into them, you can see that there has been this years of neglect. There's invasive species, litter, erosion problems, abandoned infrastructure, all things you're very familiar with, and things that need to be remedied. This is really the most perfect view, I think, of the ravines. It highlights exactly what we're trying to accomplish. We have people in apartment buildings that don't have backyards. We have space available. How can we make them more inviting? How can we get trails there? How can we make them more useful from a recreational point of view, but also functionally to help us manage the stormwater and the wetter, wilder weather that we're going to be facing? And the one word that I really, out of the ravine strategy that pops out, is connection. It's about connecting people to nature. It's about providing opportunities for people to connect with each other. And then the ravines themselves need to be connected through these east-west corridors. I mentioned the Meadowway. I just wanted to give you a shot of this. So again, this 16-kilometer corridor, lots of potential here. Mainly grass that's been, worn down over time, doesn't have a great infiltration capacity. How can we reimagine this, reduce overland flow? A lot of that can be accomplished through the Meadowway. And here's where we're going with the Meadowway and some of the areas that have been remediated. We're planting gardens, we're bringing back biodiversity, we're improving those trails, improving the crossings across the roads to make them safer. And we're really using that with residents. They've been leading that role until COVID, a lot of the planting, and we also have urban gardens that are performing in there as well. So that is all that I had to kind of share. Again, I think, I've had a great time here at City Hall and transitioning into this new role. I mentioned I do everything in threes. One highlight was releasing the resilience strategy. The second was meeting Donnie, and I'm hopeful the third will be that we secure the funding to complete this work that is so very important. And with that, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, certainly. Great. Excellent presentation, Jennifer. I would ask the audience to please send in your questions. We do have some coming in, so we'll get to those in just a moment. I was going to say, as you know, in my line of work, which is buried infrastructure, right? Precast concrete products being used for that type of infrastructure, sewer, storm drainage. We often use the line out of sight, out of mind. A lot of that infrastructure that goes in place to keep things functional for our communities, we don't see. And, just through your presentation, especially talking about the CSO projects that are going on, a lot of the people driving by, walking by, really just don't know anything of what's going on underground. And those are monumental engineering projects, in terms of what you're taking on in terms to treat and deal with the climate change and building some resiliency. So, amazing projects. And, that was also, shall I say, a reason to put some perspective with Toronto, is because some of the scale of these projects that go on in the city of Toronto are just, sometimes unimaginable, right? So, yeah. So with that, let's get right to the questions, Jennifer, and I'll just go through the list here. So, and just continue sending them in to our audience. Please do so. So the one question has to deal with, obviously, overland flow, which contributes to greater outlet flows. And the question was being asked that, some neighbors might be paving a little extra of their front yard. Some developers are trying to steal a little more green space because they're trying to create parking space, because we are, obviously solo drivers of our vehicles and we need places to put them. The question asked is, what is the city doing to try and manage some of that use of what would be green space now converted over to hard surface?
Right. Well, I mean, certainly the driveway issue is a big one. There's always the people that try to sneak out that little bit of extra on there. And we do have bylaw officers, and frankly, we've had people have to dig them back up, and they're not happy about it. But they didn't get a permit, they didn't follow the rules. So we do have an enforcement program that's there. City planning, again, it's funny, out of all the departments, I've always said city planning is the one that that I least understand, because it's not really an engineering thing, it's a planning exercise. So I always kind of struggle with their process. But they do look at green space on site. And so now in the city of Toronto, for these larger buildings, they're required to have a portion of the land that's also parkland and green on that property. So it's called Section 42. You have two options. The preferred option is that it's an on-site park dedication that is put on there. If it's not big enough, then you have to give cash in lieu as Section 42, and the city accumulates that money to buy parkland. So then when a property goes up for sale, it can be bought and turned into a park. So one, the park is recreational, but we also know that the park is also functional in terms of, you know, green space and that infiltration capacity that's on there. So so those would be two examples of that. What we're not doing yet, I'd like to see, is the permeable pavements. We have done a great job with a program called Better Homes TO, and it's a one-stop shop for you for energy efficiency in your home. And it's great because it lets you think about, you know, what what you can do now versus the what you can do later. So if you're going to move towards an electric vehicle, these are the things you need to think about in advance, like what upgrades are needed. And so it kind of takes you through the process, because we know people aren't doing all the upgrades all at once. We don't have the same sort of thing for your home or your property in terms of managing water. So I'd like to see that we have or incorporate permeable pavements into Better Homes TO. So we are looking at that. You know, when the water rate budget comes back to council, that's when we'll be asking those questions and saying, hey, like, what is the way forward on this? There's two approaches. There's the approach of incentives. And so you have an incentive to put permeable pavements and diversions of you know, water onto your property. Or there's the other thought where we take the water budget and we split it into two. So you have your water withdrawal charge, and then you have a water kind of disposal charge, and that can include your stormwater. And then over time, you can make changes and make that value come down. So there's two different approaches. I don't know where we land, but it is something that we're all thinking about. And, you know, from a policy standpoint, there's the incentive camp, and then there's the stormwater charge tax camp, and I don't know where it'll land, but I'm certainly watching it closely.
Right. Yeah, no, okay, great. Yeah, certainly with a big city, you know, and the masses of people, that, you know, everybody kind of has to take care of their own space, so everybody can contribute to bringing solution to the problem. So I guess that lends well with our theme of this National Public Works Week, which is Stronger Together, everybody working together to bring solutions. So great, thanks for that answer. So we have another question here. For the Meadowway project, do you require a lot do you have to do a lot of liaison with Hydro One to request them to modify the maintenance of their right-of-ways?
So I'm not sure on the partnership side. Certainly the agreements are done. They are a partner. They're very familiar with what's happening. We've already started a lot of that work through that corridor, and they're very much at the table. So, I mean, the answer is probably yes. They work on it. They're part of it, and we need them at the table going forward. We've had great interest in that project. We've had investment from the Weston Foundation. The Weston Foundation is looking to, they do matching funds. So they're watching closely through this budget process as well through the federal government. If we receive more funding, they are very keen on co-funding so that we can finally complete that project. Again, it's about mostly planting. So it's not hugely disruptive to the hydro fields themselves. We know they're there and recognize they're there. It's about reimagining the space around them. So you know, obviously electricity delivery has to be number one, and then everything else kind of falls in around to just make the space better.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Well, certainly it's, you know, trying to take every opportunity of salvageable or usable space, again, in the big city. So, okay, here's another question. Are there any plans to revise stormwater management quality, balance, and quantity targets to adapt to climate change?
So I'm not sure. We're going to have a report back from Toronto Water in the summer, I believe, and that's starting to look at you know, that budgeting process and how we're doing it. And in terms of that. So I'm not totally sure, and I understand the question, like, again, if it's on the homeowner side, the commercial side, all of our big landowners, we are looking at that. What we have to be careful of is the last time Toronto tried to move towards that sort of split stormwater thing and looking at the volume of stormwater you have and how you can reduce it, what's going over into the sewers. It kind of got, it got misrepresented as a roof tax. And it wasn't really seen that it was, revenue neutral. And then you had the opportunity to decrease the amount of money you spend on it. So so we're looking to see what city staff bring back on that and that target in the next thing. But we have to watch that it's really understood by the public in a way where we can get adoption of it. And that's my worry. That's the one benefit of incentive programs. Very clear, very easy, not confusion.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And part of that also, I think in terms of how the question was phrased also is that, with climate change, it's not necessarily a static change in the climate. It's always going to continue to change and evolve. So, some of what's in place with targets to deal with stormwater also have to kind of move and change along with, the bigger issue of climate change overall. So. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. And I think the other is just looking at, designing infrastructure not for today, but designing the infrastructure for tomorrow. And I think that's the bigger question. And that's why we're embedding that question of resilience into design now, right? So has this accounted for population growth? Has this accounted for climate change? Has, in any other big perturbation that we think we're going to be subjected to? And I think the other thing we've realized is that when you put a design life on stuff, we've often extended it. So maybe we just need to assume we're going with 100-year design life here and fully prepare for that. And because that's, I think, certainly how we got into the situation is we weren't expecting to not upgrade the system in 100 years, right?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, here's another question. Which initiative do you see being the most likely to bring short-term wins? And which challenge do you feel would be the hardest to crack in the medium or long term? So I guess maybe the best opportunity for the success, with these projects in Toronto.
Well, I mean, it all comes to funding, right? So the wet weather master plan, I will say, the goal I think is 2038 right now, to finish all of these projects and to ensure no discharges into Lake Ontario. We all feel that's too late. We would like to, and I know Mayor Tory would like to advance that to be in 10 years, but we know that needs $1.2 billion more money. And we haven't been able to get that from the federal or the provincial government. It's also not in the budget, it just came out. The funding right now is all really around climate change, but mitigation and about decreasing greenhouse gases. And even like the C40 International City Summit that brings all the cities leaders together to talk and learn from each other. It's all about climate mitigation and decreasing greenhouse gases. We haven't changed to preparing for climate change yet. Like that mindset, that mind shift hasn't happened internationally. It hasn't happened with our federal government. In Toronto, we're very lucky because the city of Toronto is getting ready for that, right? And they have to, because we have these combined sewer overflows, which are making it super apparent to us that this is an impact we need to mitigate. Lake Ontario levels is another good example. These high levels that you think are like a 1 in 100 year event. We had them in 2017, we had them in 2019. So I guess my long answer to your somewhat shorter question is it's easier for us to get wins around climate mitigation and decreasing greenhouse gases because the international world is really galvanized by it right now. They're not as galvanized by getting ready for the impacts of climate change. I think that shift will come. The funding for that will also shift. But we're very lucky in the city of Toronto that we've already laid out this plan. In fact, we've been laying out this plan since 2003, or we'd be in trouble. In terms of short-term wins, though, I mean, the Ravine Strategy is a huge short-term win. If we can get this funding, it's a 10-year implementation plan for all those trails that I showed you and all those priority areas. So that could be completed in 10 years with this additional funding, which is not huge, 65 over 5, it's 104 over 10. it's a very small amount of money when you look at a federal funding program.
Yep. Okay. Great. I had a question of my own, which is, when you were talking about the Ravine strategy and you were talking about, a sizable amount of funding or dollars that have to go towards investing into that area, making them more accessible, cleaning them up. Sometimes, as a counselor and trying to approve a budget value like that might be difficult because it's hard to realize what the tangible is, right? It's not necessarily infrastructure that's built. It's a bit of tidying up and grooming and everything. Everything looks nice, right? But obviously, probably COVID-19 has been a huge opportunity here to say, we need more public open space. Here's a chance that we can hopefully get the funding from the federal level and the provincial level. Obviously, funding has to come out of the budget. So I guess it was just kind of, what's the approach there? Is it easier now? Is it a hard argument to make? That type thing.
Yeah, it's funny because when you start to ask a question, I was like, COVID, that's the key thing. So I started advocating for this money in 2019. And certainly that advocacy changed a lot last year when everything in Toronto closed. The only thing that was open was our public spaces in our parks. And frankly, a lot of people don't go into the ravine systems, didn't go into the ravine systems as much as they did last year. My office was swarmed with requests to put in for cleanup and people pointing out, invasive species and pointing litter and requests. It had the attention of the mayor. We created those student internships to clean up litter and to clean up invasive species. So one, because the public was, really taking notice because there was so much more pressure in them as well. There was more litter that was there. And it was also a good news story because students didn't have their traditional parks and rec jobs either. So certainly when we changed the advocacy last year as well with the federal government to point out, the need for green space, the throne speech they had last fall said this pandemic has highlighted the need for every Canadian to have access to green space. That was in their throne speech. So
really? Yes.
Yeah, exactly, right? And then the money came. So it was good because they were hearing the message that space is important. And certainly I was trying to pull more evidence out through the past to, a lot of it is anecdotal, but, during the Spanish flu, they were putting patients outside, people were being outside. And, there was this knowledge about, disease transmission being different outside and the benefits of the outdoors that were there, not as in a scientific kind of documented clean way as I would have liked as a scientist, but more anecdotal. And I think everybody certainly learned that. And it does show that having this green space will make us more resilient in the future as well.
Right, for sure. Okay. Well, I think that concludes our presentation here. So I'm just going to pull up my my last screen, and with that, I just wanted to say thank you very much to Councillor Jennifer McKelvey, for taking the time and presenting the information of what's going on in the big city of Toronto. Always good to hear. We've got some anecdotes of gratitude to you, Jennifer, for presenting, and great presentation. So just want to pass that on to you as well. I'd also like to mention to you that with your participation in our event, the Ontario Public Works Association will be making a donation to Habitat for Humanity. So thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you. It's great to join you. Great to be with the technical audience.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, and if there's any further questions, we'll be sure to get in touch with you, Jennifer. And with that, I hope you can stay well and stay safe. And we hope to see you soon again.
Thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of our presentation today. Just as a last reminder that there is an opportunity for you to participate, hopefully in our closing session, which will take place tomorrow, Friday at 12 noon. This concludes all the sessions for day 4, and I hope you all yourselves can stay well and stay safe. Bye for now.